the main conclusion of most people who've been in the field for a while is that we need both. That we do need to have the possibility of comparisons of different sorts. Very occasionally, random control trials, because they don't work in most circumstances and they're not appropriate. But certainly comparisons and quasi-experiments and different kinds of comparisons are important, and these need to be complemented by various theory-based and internalized forensic analyses of the links in the chain between cause and effect. Next, please. There are 4 sets of considerations that I would use when considering how to construct an approach to the evaluation of impacts. This is very much a personal view. It would be regarded by some as being contentious, but I think it's quite important to put out what is one's views, because then you have a basis for discussion and debate that's a bit better founded. So the 4 things for me are the political agendas of the actors. Second, the technical issues of what is possible. Thirdly, some fairly serious arguments from the philosophy of science. And finally, ethical considerations. Next. It's important to recognize, as I already alluded to, that there are political drivers in all of this. Of course, advocates of experimental methods want to better meet social and economic needs, but they also have other motives, and it's important that we understand them. They want to legitimate or delegitimate institutional and policy goals. There is clearly an interest in some quarters to use certain kinds of methods to reinforce or to undermine types of policy. They want to simplify policies to perhaps find the silver bullet, certainly to reduce costs and to manage risks, which are not unreasonable goals, but they are somewhat different from better meeting social needs. There's a wish in some quarters to reduce public expenditure, which is the nothing works agenda, again on a smaller scale. And there's occupational politics, which is careerism. So, for example, in the United States, I can think of 4 or 5 major evaluators who've changed the titles of their articles and books to include the word scientific in the months that followed the publication by the US administration of guidance that only scientific forms of evaluation would be considered. So, this kind of careerism is normal in every field. I'm sure it doesn't happen in the humanitarian action field, but it has been known to happen. Next, please. Technical issues around choices of methods are well rehearsed. They include problems constructing and maintaining control groups. They include the practicalities of random evaluation, which require, for example, genuine central control, administrative capacity, resources. There's the risks of contamination, how the control group, for example, or some control situation may be influenced by the site of an intervention. A tendency to reductionism, a focus to limit things on what has been called outcomes of interest. So it is very necessary in most methodologies of impact assessment to regard the world as a closed system. And the problems that occur in terms of understanding when one acknowledges that the world is an open system are highlighted by this tendency and tension between openness and reductionism. There's statistical power questions, which is sample size, what the statisticians call the small n problem, which is how on earth do you explain things when you don't have large samples? And there are trade-offs between internal validity and external validity and our ability to generalize. Next, please. I want to distinguish, however, between the practical risks and the logistical difficulties on the one hand and fitness for purpose. Many of the objections to experimental and quasi-experimental methods, when they are appropriate, and there are people who continue to object to them even when they are appropriate, can be overcome with careful attention to procedures and protocols, but sometimes difficulties are rooted in the object and its context as well as in the methods. So there are times when objections and debates around impact assessment, especially of the narrow view that I've been describing, are valid because they're about the object, but there are often times when some of the methodological debates can be dealt with. Next, please. As an example of this, let me compare 3 scenarios. The first scenario, standardized interventions in identical settings with common beneficiaries. This would be the classic place where experimental methods arose in school curriculum mathematics experiments, where you gave the same different tests to sets of students who were of a similar age, in a similar education background, and you then tried to see whether there were differences in the likelihood of these tests picking up education advance among the pupils. So standardized intervention, identical settings, common beneficiaries. A second scenario, standardized interventions in diverse settings, possibly with diverse beneficiaries. Here you're recognizing that settings are not the same. So if you're trying to do things in different parts of a country and you're trying to adapt them to different urban situations or different population groups or different types of industrial problems or different community mixes. A third scenario would be customized interventions, where the intervention is not the same in diverse settings with diverse beneficiaries. The latter would be, for example, in my own country, in the UK, this would be the classic social and economic development program, where government would say, we are interested in proposers to come forward to design something that is particularly suitable to meet the needs of their community, that will address the general problem of and will be widely applicable to many different groups. That would be an example of the third scenario. Next, please. And the reason I'm elaborating these is to say that these different scenarios necessarily pull for different methodologies. Scenario one is actually quite well adapted to experiments. Same intervention, same setting, same beneficiaries. Largish numbers. Scenario two is better adapted to quasi-experiments and comparisons and combinations of methods. And scenario three is much better adapted to case studies, narrative, qualitative approaches that build plausible theories. So there is a kind of an analytic question at the root of choice, which is to do with understanding the scenario you're in and the characteristics of this object that you're trying to evaluate. Next, please. Experiments do tend to favor single inputs and outcomes that can be delivered in discrete packages that are not too mixed up with other things, that have a relatively short implementation chain, both in the sense of time and in the complexity and ease of implementation, and where the intervention is repeated often, the large N question. They are best for projects that deliver a known service to large numbers of recipients, are possible for relatively simple programs, but unsuited to complex multi-measure strategies and policies. Next, please. This is actually well acknowledged by even the most enthusiastic advocates of experimental methods. And if you take Esther Duflo of the MIT Poverty Lab, she has said that randomized evaluations are not suitable for all types of programs. They are suitable for programs that are targeted to individuals or communities and where the objectives are well defined. For example, the efficacy of foreign aid dispersed as general budget support cannot be evaluated in this way. Now, that's quite an important statement because, and you'll find that most of the serious protagonists in the field will have said that somewhere. They don't always say it when they're on a platform advocating the superiority of a particular method, but I think the wiser people do actually recognize the limits of what can and can't be done with that particular toolkit.